The Last of Us to me is just barely a video game. You know what I mean? Like when you think about a video game, you think about interactivity, the ability to make choices, almost any choice you want. And, Naughty Dog has kind of specialized in these very streamlined, almost on rails stories where the interactivity is the action. Like you can, if you're playing Uncharted, you can climb up a cliff in maybe 2 or 3 different ways and take out the bad guys in, several different ways. The same thing with The Last of Us. You can sneak around, you can make a lot of noise. Those are the choices you can make. But the rest of it, like pound square to get the infected off of you. It's not really you can't choose your own adventure in the same way that you can in other video games, kill NPCs, etc., kind of like do game breaking stuff to kind of like derail the story. You can't do that. And I think that is part of why The Last of Us works so well, because it is a streamlined story where you can't just, follow some NPC into some bizarre side quest and then do all kinds of strange things.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to what I believe is episode 41 of Visionaries. I'm always thrown off because our audio counter and our video counter they don't match because, people on audio don't like super long podcasts, although maybe Jason's track record shows differently because, how many 3-hour binge modes have I listened to in the past, basically? It's like, I swear to God, everything with Mallory Rubin is long, and
it is long.
I'm okay with that.
It's good.
She's good at it. So.
It's long and high quality.
Yeah, 100%. It's like I find myself having to listen to House of R over 6 different drives every single week. It's like, hey, I'm hopping in the car and I'm outside for 30 minutes. I'll put it on and I'll only get through a 6th of the episode, but it's okay. Anyway, welcome everybody. Really glad to have you all here. Really glad to have Jason here. I was reminiscing recently about when Jason used to co-host Achievement Oriented, the Ringer video game podcast that I appeared and I called in from this shitty little closet they had turned into a workroom at ESPN, and I was just like, all right, we've come a long way. Anyway, so Jason's here. If you're unfamiliar with Jason, I'll give a little bit of background about Jason. Jason is a host at Crooked Media and is co-host X-Ray Vision, which is a podcast that covers a broad swath of entertainment, which is what we're going to be talking about here, notably comic books, fantasy. Jason, anything else I'm missing? Sci-fi.
That about does it.
Yeah, and Jason previously worked at The Ringer, where he hosted a podcast called Binge Mode, as well as Achievement Oriented that I mentioned earlier. Binge Mode became, I believe, one of the most listened to sort of geek culture entertainment podcasts across all mediums. And he is also one of the hosts of the official Game of Thrones podcast for House of the Dragon. Jason, how are you doing? What's going on in your world?
I'm doing well. I'm eagerly consuming The Last of Us. Hanging out, doing podcasts, doing my podcast X-Ray Vision twice a week now, with co-host Rosie Knight, and just grinding away.
Yeah, I was gonna ask I haven't heard X-Ray Vision for Last of Us episode 2. What's if you had to spoil your own podcast a little bit for us, what's your take?
It continues to be great. Much like House of the Dragon, the changes, at least in our opinion, have been really additive and really smart. And the stuff that they've kept the same, they've subverted a little bit to keep the people who are well versed with the story through the game surprised. And I just think it's great. The casting is off the charts. I love the background info we're getting about how the plague started, information about Fedra, about the Fireflies. It's just great. It's just wonderful. And the performances again are just off the charts. Good.
Yeah, I won't spoil it entirely if people haven't seen the second episode of The Last of Us, but I will say the prologue of every single episode has been the best part in my opinion. Prologue of episode 1, which is the recreation in the beginning of the game, excellent. And then the same here, that scene as well. So, or that entire sequence. So I'm genuinely impressed. But a big part of this conversation and why we wanted to have this conversation is that, and I've struggled to kind of put my finger on what to call it, but I know, Jason, you've been at sort of the forefront of this. It feels like, we have some reporting now that how big The Last of Us has been, which is more than 18 million people have watched the first episode in the past like 8 or 9 days on HBO Max, is the second biggest premiere on HBO behind only House of the Dragon, right? Which is a Game of Thrones IP. It makes sense why House of the Dragon was so successful in the past 13 years on any HBO platform. And I think that something that I've sort of noticed anecdotally, especially the past like 4 or 5 years, and probably Thrones being a bigger part of this, is like the nerds have taken over television, which is like awesome. I mean, it's not that sci-fi and fantasy weren't big before, but now it feels like every smash hit fantasy or every smash hit television series is fantasy or sci-fi. Whether it be The Mandalorian, whether it be Thrones, whether it be The Last of Us, and it's like all of this like nerd culture. I mean, what are your thoughts, Jason? Like, what do you think started this, and why do you think we're here at this very
why did this happen? I think it happened. I think there's a suite of factors working all together. I think one, the technology got to the point where you can make this stuff look really good on television. I think second of all, Game of Thrones in particular kind of proved that fantasy could really make hay with a television audience in a huge way, in an international way, which kind of opened the floodgates. In terms of, comic book movies, same thing, the tech got there. And by the time the tech got there, you had 50 years, 60 years of comic book stories kind of like waiting in the vault to be adapted, just waiting to find an audience. And now all that stuff is coming out. And maybe with The Last of Us now, you're seeing the same thing happen with video games. Fallout is currently in production over in New York. I'm eager to see what a Fallout video game television adaptation might be like. But it feels like the year 2005 for the video game to television and movies space right now. Obviously there's been some really, really fun, like animated adaptations, Arcane, Castlevania. But The Last of Us really feels like it's kind of like blowing the cork out of the live action adaptations, that you can really do this well if you have the right property with a good story existing, and you have people who, one, understand the story, and two, understand how to change it for television so it works.
Yeah. I find this very fascinating, both as reporter and CEO of a production company where we're, most of our work is unscripted, but on the scripted side, paying attention to everything. It's not, BioShock now has a greenlit series. Yep. Duke Nukem has a greenlit, right? Like there's it's just like you go down the list of like rich video game IPs, and it's just, there's so many of them, right? Yeah. And some of them, but I think in the past, we've generally thought about, they've been abject failures. Like the Doom movie is something that comes immediately to mind. And it's like,
I kind of like it.
Right, same.
I weirdly kind of liked it.
Pleasure.
Yeah.
But it's not good. Like,
no, it's not good.
Objectively, it's not good. It's like fun, but it's not good. And I think that, now we've gotten to a point where video games are getting full love as storytelling, right? Like I think we all started to understand with time, with the technology, especially in the like some in the Xbox PS2 generation, but certainly in the Xbox 360 PS3 generation, which is where like The Last of Us and a bunch of these other IPs come from, is that it got to a point where games could be that immersive, and so therefore the storytelling in video games could be deep, which lends themselves to other entertainment properties too.
That's an interesting conversation because we've on X-Ray Vision, we've been reflecting on the fact that listen, your mileage may vary, but The Last of Us to me is just barely a video game. You know what I mean? Like when you think about a video game, you think about interactivity, the ability to make choices, almost any choice you want. And, Naughty Dog has kind of specialized in these very streamlined, almost on rails stories where the interactivity is the action. Like you can, if you're playing Uncharted, you can climb up a cliff in maybe 2 or 3 different ways and take out the bad guys in, several different ways. The same thing with The Last of Us. You can sneak around, you can make a lot of noise. Those are the choices you can make. But the rest of it, like pound square to get the infected off of you. It's not really you can't choose your own adventure in the same way that you can in other video games, kill NPCs, etc., kind of like do game breaking stuff to kind of like derail the story. You can't do that. And I think that is part of why The Last of Us works so well, because it is a streamlined story where you can't just, follow some NPC into some bizarre side quest and then do all kinds of strange things. The lore is very grounded. It's part of what makes it so easy to adapt. Not easy, but adaptable, I should say.
It does make me worried though, because I think Arcane was a very specific touch point at the end of 2020 because end of 2021. Sorry, all my years blend together the past three. Yeah. Arcane is like what it did extremely well. And actually, if you compare it to Riot's other scripted property, which was Players, which is a live action mockumentary series that came out last summer, they couldn't be more different. Like Arcane,
they could not be more different.
Yeah, Arcane was, if you didn't know anything about League of Legends, you could watch it and get into it. And the amount of people that I saw, especially in like yours and I's social circle of like, sort of geek culture podcast hosts, etc., that were talking about it and had never even touched League. That was a good sign. That was like, oh my God, like this universe is now more accessible than ever. Versus, looking at Players, like Players extremely inaccessible. If you didn't know League esports, it was tough. So
if you didn't know esports, you might think it was a documentary. In fact, I think you would think it was a documentary if you had no idea like where the property came from, what it was. I kind of liked the swing, even though it mostly didn't work for me. But I like that they took that chance.
Yeah. But my point being, broadly, it makes me worried with kind of all of these television executives and film executives buying up so much gaming property that like it's almost going to make this like vicious cycle where like a certain amount of them are bound to fail, but will the majority succeed or majority fail? And like how will that hurt kind of the bubble that we've been in, which is like gaming doesn't make good television, gaming doesn't make good movies. And like, yeah, we're on an upswing of that right now where like, okay, a couple properties, Arcane, Last of Us, etc., are breaking out and being successful and making the stories more accessible. But like, if we have a bunch of other things that get greenlit that are actually shit, then we're in a different position. You know what I mean? Like, we're in a position where people go back to saying like, oh, video games doesn't make good TV.
Sure. I mean, well, I think it's maybe worthwhile kind of like trying to figure out why it doesn't work. I think Arcane and Castlevania, because they are animated, allow the filmmakers to delve into the lore in a really immersive and fully committed way that doesn't feel like they cheaped out. Like the Assassin's Creed movie, for instance. And, for those familiar with the Assassin's Creed game, I defy anyone to explain the lore of the Assassin's Creed world in like less than 30 seconds. It's freaking insane. And they really tried to like bring that to the screen. And honestly, that just requires like an hour of expo dump, like to get you even to a place where you feel like, okay, I kind of understand what's going on. And, that's just so expensive. Like I think about something like Halo that really kind of was pretty good for the live action television space. But there were definitely times where you're like, okay, I can see that background is like cardboard that's painted and it just takes you out of it. You have to, with animated, you can go all the way and just do everything that's necessary to bring that actual video game world to life. When you go live action, you've got to pick your shots because budgets are not going to be unlimited. You're not going to be able to show, everything. This is why the Fallout show is going to be really interesting because, man, that requires incredible effects for you to buy it. And that's what's so hard about. That's part of what's so hard about live action is making the choice about what part of the world can be realistically adapted to a live action kind of presentation. And I think part of the thing that's kind of like held video game adaptations back in the past is that the game companies, the publisher, whoever owns the IP, has been so protective of the product. And I get it, rightfully so, that they just haven't in the past made good choices about what thing to leave out and what thing to bring over to the adaptation.
Fair. Yeah, I think that that's right. Like if it, especially in those open world games, contrasting to what you were saying earlier with Last of Us being like a very narrow, like this is the path. The story ends the same way no matter what outcome. When you start playing in the like open world RPG sandbox, it's like, all right, like you have too much material to deal with, right? Like prioritizing the material is really hard.
Yeah, I guess like for Fallout, you could just make season 1 like the main story, the sole survivor looking for his son. Spoiler for those who haven't played Fallout 4, and trying to figure out what happened there, who kidnapped his son, when it happened, who murdered his wife, etc. I guess you could make that the season 1, but anybody who's played that game will tell you that's the story is so much more than that in the relationship between the sole survivor, depending, your mileage may vary, and the various NPCs in the game. How do you trim that down and make that a coherent story? It's going to be really interesting to see the choices.
So, one thing that is really interesting to me is I think that these IPs and some of the others are being viewed as like sort of the way through break through the streaming wars, right? Like we've ended up in a place now where I think there's too much streaming content. Like it's just too much for any one person to digest. You have like infinite amount of choices of like, which one am I going to open up app wise, and what am I going to choose in this app if you're a normal end consumer? And I think that video games, sort of nerd culture, sci-fi, comic books, kind of down the list. Star Wars has like always been an IP that breaks through the noise, but all these various things. The reason that like Disney and Netflix and HBO, et cetera, are like doubling down on these IPs is because they see it as a way to break through kind of the mundane nature of a lot of these streaming platforms. But I'm fearful of a world where we have too much of that, right? Like where there's too much of similar IPs to one another, and they become the mundaneness, right? That is on the streaming platform, basically.
I get that concern. I also feel like it's the same as it ever was. Like the Western ruled cinemas and television for, if you want to go back to the early days of pulp literature, it was the Western for like 80 years, and it was like Westerns. Go back to television of 15, 20, 30, 40 years ago, and it's cop procedural, law drama, medical drama. Various sitcoms revolving around the family, always revolving around the family. Yes, you had different workplace things, but it was like, WKRP in Cincinnati or The Office. Yes, but that was like workplace as the family. So I am less concerned about that because we've always been like watching shit that's the same, that's very similar to all the other stuff that's out there. And secondarily, like, while we are opining about what works, what doesn't work, what may work in the future, nobody actually knows. Nobody actually knows what's going to be the thing. A question I get asked a lot, a conversation I have a lot, especially in the post Game of Thrones world, is like, oh, monoculture, will there ever be the thing? Will there ever be the show that unites us again as one mass audience around the virtual water cooler? Yeah, somebody will figure it out. I don't know what it is, but at some point, somebody will figure that out. But if people could easily figure out how stuff worked, how creative stuff worked, what's going to be a hit, then people would do that. But we can't do it, which makes it kind of fun.
Well, you look at like Netflix second biggest show this past year is Wednesday, and I just like by like raw viewership, and I'm just like,
where'd that come from?
Me, yeah, that's what I'm saying. If you told me at the end of 2021 that the second biggest IP on all of Netflix by viewership was going to be an Addams Family IP, I would probably fucking laughed at you, looking at the history of since looking at the history of that IP and how played out it is. But they found something that was different that like hit a youth audience, became massively popular on TikTok, and it took off in its own way, right? Like it found an audience that got engaged. And I that's actually another question I wanted to kind of point at you, which is like how social media is changing entertainment consumption, especially short form social media. Yeah, like Twitter in particular and YouTube had a very outsized effect on Game of Thrones, I think, because like if you were you saw like the conversation that was happening around Thrones, and if you weren't into it, you wanted to get into it because you saw like 100 people you knew or followed or whatever that you were a fan of their content tweeting about Game of Thrones every single Sunday night, right? Like that was the thing. And I think that YouTube as well has really played its own part in that for some of the other shows, especially in the comic book world and Star Wars, etc. Like the reaction videos and, you know, now they're memes onto themselves, like the new Rockstar thumbnails, etc. You know, what was he cooking and did he know? You know, people are like, "What did that come from?" Oh, it's like this, you know, channel of like people that break down literally every minute opinion or fact or, you know, like Easter egg ever and make a 10-minute video on the one little tiny little thing. You know, like, and it's they had their own little place, and so I think that. But now we're seeing that with TikTok, and I think like TikTok is driving people to buy certain things. Consumer behavior, it's driving people to watch certain things. What are your broad thoughts on like how it's affecting entertainment, and like if you had to predict, like where is it going to drive people? Like, do you think there's certain genres that stick out or anything?
I think the effect is that it's kind of like elevated voices. I mean, New Rockstar is a great example of that. It's elevated voices of people who are, you know, experts in this kind of like micro field, whether it's comic books, comic book movies, Spider-Man in particular, you know, whatever it is, whatever the little kind of like nerd chasm is. And people have always wanted to understand what's going on, to know what people are talking about. And social media provides this kind of like micro-targeted dump of information about like what this thing is. You don't know what is going on in Game of Thrones? Watch this. Here's a little snippet of this. It's great advertising, but it's also it gives people an ability to understand like what the conversation is, give them context for that conversation. And I think people just crave that. Where do I think
it's not a new phenomenon?
It's not a new phenomenon. Yeah, that's
and it's so funny. It's so funny that The Ringer, your former employer, and you became such a big part of that sort of dialogue because like Grantland was that at ESPN, frankly, but for sports. Like they were, you know, the story inside the story, deeper thought and analysis on the little things. Pick the little things and go, you know, 1,000 times deeper on the little things. And it's like, but for some reason over the past, you know, one reason or another, the past 10 years, like the nerd culture stuff has gotten that treatment, which is
again, I think
very good for it.
Sports is an interesting discursion here because again, people care about stories, they care about characters. And the way, you know, my personal philosophy is the way we engage with, if you're a sports fan, the way you engage with sports is exactly the same way as people who are fans of Game of Thrones or whatever engage with that thing. You know, if you didn't know the backstory of, I don't know, Joe Burrow, you know, you didn't know him, you didn't know where he went to school, then what would the final score of, you know, of a game mean? Like it wouldn't mean anything if you didn't ruminate on who these players are, what they have gone through, what they have achieved to this point, the struggles that they're facing, whether they can, you know, cement their legacy or not. That's the stuff that you care about. And it's the same way we talk about any story, any show, anything. It's just the way that we engage with the world. It's the way our brains are wired to make everything a narrative, a story.
Well, yeah. And it's the one thing that like, you know, I've been kind of reminiscing a little bit and like thinking deeper thought about like the DeMar Hamlin stuff the past few weeks since his heart attack on the field in the first or sorry, not the first, but the Cincy Buffalo game that happened at the beginning of January. And thinking about that, you know, like it's how deep even a story you don't touch very frequently can be, right? Like he was a backup player who got to start this year because there was another injury on the Bills already and he got thrown in there and then has this freak accident and everybody gathers around him and like, you know, all the only people that knew the deep lore and the story of his life, which is super fascinating, was like the Buffalo Bills beat writers, right? Like, but now everybody knows it because it's just like amplified. It's all these stories, and in a weird way, I think that has some parallels to the deep, rich IP around comic books and video games. Is like there's so much IP that's only the surface has been scratched of, and I think that's, you know, being able to like go further and deeper into those stories, into those narratives that only, you know, people like yourself who you know study this stuff religiously basically know every little corner of.
Well, it's nice that people believe that I know every little corner of, but it's, you know, it's a lot of it's a lot of research and listening to other people who really know stuff. You know, when I was working with Mal, when I work with Rosie, it's always nice to be collaborating with people who I feel like know more than me. It's it's actually like kind of like anxiety filled for me when I'm being like, oh no, do I know the most here? Like, then I might mess up. You know what I mean? And just back to sports for a second, you know, thinking about the tragic situation with Jamar, and it's great. And it's, thank God, like he's well, and on the way to being well. I think that's the way we are wired to engage with stories is like that's how we get in trouble with sports also, because you view human beings as characters. Like, how many times have we seen, you know, someone get injured on the field and then somebody be like, well, you know, the implications for this team going forward in terms of like, you know, the roster and the lineup. And it's like, hold on, a person just got hurt. And it can be hard
shut the fuck up and focus on the person for a second.
It can be hard for people to disconnect that, like, that narrative brain, you know, when we should.
Yeah. There's a good side and a bad side. The good side is like when somebody, you know, all his entire life story and the quintessential sports story of overcoming adversity and like making it, right? Like that before his injury, that was his story. And like, that's the good side, is when people like buy into that. It inspires people. It makes people, you know, go fundraise the tens of millions of dollars that they have for his charity now, right? It makes people like feel deeply personal and connected because they see some of themselves in someone like Damar Hamlin. And then there's that bad side, exactly what you're talking about. Like, let's get down to the sports analytics of how this will affect the Buffalo Bills secondary, and like what, you know, now they're running a third stringer, and it's like, all right, just shut the hell up. Like this is not, it's not the time or the place. That's the bad side for sure. So, you were talking a little bit about your personal anxieties. I wanted to have mostly a discussion about video game media and everything else, but I do want to kind of touch on, because I don't know if I've seen you talk a whole lot about the decision to leave the Ringer and go to Crooked, and I've been keeping up with your show now at Crooked. Walk me through that a little bit, because that was a big jump. You were such a quintessential part of the Ringer's sort of geek culture coverage.
Well, I think it's like this. It's the same reasons that anybody kind of like works through when they're thinking about leaving a job. Is there more opportunity for me elsewhere? And ultimately, I came down to the decision, as hard as it was, that was the case. And thankfully, that has panned out. But it definitely was like, you know, I think you look at, people, I don't know how many people actually give a shit about this, but like looking at you know, that decision from the outside, it might seem like, oh yeah, makes a lot of sense, and you just do that, and then there's no trepidation at all. But it definitely, there were moments where it's like, okay, if this doesn't work out, I guess I'll just like wait tables again, and that'll be fine. Like, you know, it was definitely a stressful situation. But I felt like, and I'm so proud of all the work I did at the Ringer, Grantland before it, and could not be more proud of the work Mallory and I did. And every time somebody reaches out, which is on a regular basis, to say I'm listening to Binge Mode for the third or fourth or fifth time, and you know, this bit that you guys did, or I never thought about stories this way, and it feels great. It feels great that that touched people in that way. You know, it's like everybody. I've said this a million times, but everybody who is a creator works really hard to create the thing that they are making, and whether people respond to it is like completely out of our hands. I've worked tremendously hard on everything I've ever done, and I feel really, really lucky that resonated with people and that they reach out about it. So that feels great.
You know, I felt a little bit of this my final year at ESPN Esports before they decided to, and you've been there too, so you know what this feels like. But I felt very, very conflicted. I had decided to leave at the end of 2020 when my contract was up, unbeknownst to them, and was like trying to figure the way out. And then they did me the favor and axed us 2 months before that decision. So rather than break my coworkers' heart, they just broke everybody's hearts for me, basically, rather than like me telling my, you know, the coworkers I love, peace the fuck out, basically. And I think that the mental hurdle I think I struggled with in making that decision, and where I think maybe you can relate, is like I was so synonymous with the work that had been done there. And, you know, my like, even now, like I was in an email today and somebody was like, yeah, big fan of all the stuff you did at ESPN. And I was like, yeah, big fan. That was 3 fucking years ago, basically, you know, like, and it's like, yeah, I'm like, I'm proud of what I've done since, but I put in so much effort, and it was so public facing, and it was so much of that. And I feel like your work at the Ringer was the same. You were like one of, you know, like I said, a big part of what, to a certain audience, what that brand was. And did you struggle with that too? Like, being able, it adds another layer to your decision making process, I would imagine, being
yes,
so synonymous.
I mean, yes and no. I remember when we were going into the last season of Game of Thrones, and obviously Binge Mode is up and running. We're doing the after show, you know, streaming on social media, which was doing huge numbers. Someone DM'd me. I think it was something like, "Hey, are you worried when Game of Thrones is over that your career will be done?" In a really, I think they, you know, in a way that felt like they weren't being a dick about it. They were really legitimately asking. And honestly, like I was, you know, I was a little concerned about it. I've always kind of, not prided myself, but I think I've managed to like weaponize my ADD in a way that's conducive to having a career. I'm interested in a lot of things. I'm curious about a lot of things. And I've managed to somehow like make that diversity of interest part of my quote unquote brand. But for, you know, on the one hand, to answer your question, I was a little concerned that I was too tied to what I was covering at one point. And secondarily, in terms of leaving after that, I think one of the wonderful things about the podcast space is that, unlike other creative mediums, like, you know, unlike writing or television, writing for television or movies, if you can create an audience and foster a community there and continue to, you know, give voice to your passions and theirs, then if you're lucky and you do it with respect, I think you can move around and take that audience with you. Does it go down a little bit? Does it, who cares? Like, I think you can go and take that audience. And ultimately part of my decision was the feeling like, you know, I think people understand what I'm about in terms of like how I cover things and how I create stuff. And I'm going to trust that they're going to come and take part in the stuff I'm going to do in the future. So, so yes and no, that was part of my decision.
One of the things you did that, when we announced this pod yesterday, I got more than a handful of messages of people because, they miss this as much as I do, which is NBA Desktop, which is one of the like, just incredible. For those maybe unfamiliar, if you're not like super into sports, Jason hosted this, like, I wouldn't call it short form. What was usual episode runtime, Jason? It was like
about
7 to 10 minutes.
Yeah, 7 to 10. We tried to keep it as, you know, under 10, but sometimes we go 10, 12.
Yeah, and so it was the show like running through the news of the NBA, but and like the funny clips of the NBA, the drama of the NBA, but like it had this like almost comedic tone to it. It was like, you know, I guess it replicates what is like kind of a sports art form, but it did it really differently in the way it was animated and presented, and everything else is like, it does like the best conversations are the ones where you can laugh with your buddies around like, you know, like around a table, you know, like you're eating dinner, you're having like, you're laughing about sports. Is like it's the Deadspin / defector trope of like some guys and like, you know, kind of all the various different things, right? Like it hits those fun sports moments, and NBA Desktop got extremely popular and won some awards as well. And Jason took those home. Do you miss it? Do you miss it as much as the people that are messaging me about, about how great it was when we announced this yesterday?
Yeah, I miss doing it. I miss, you know, and its successor, all caps. And I have to shout out my collaborator, co-creator, Jason Gallagher, who's now doing great things over with JJ Redick and Tommy Alter with the Old Man and 3 Pod and the various incarnations of that. One of the most creative and great to collaborate human beings that I've ever worked with. Really just like an important person in my creative and professional life, and I'm so proud of what we did. I do miss it, and I also feel like, you know, I mentioned how many things I'm interested in. I think whether this was conscious or not, um, I'm just a person who I don't lose interest in things, so to speak. But when you feel like you've kind of done all the creative things that you can do, without, you know, I don't know, adding something, you know, going to a different medium or whatever, then I'm okay with shutting it down. I thought that we had our say. I think we were very influential. Like, you can watch any number of ESPN talking head shows now that I feel like we've had an influence on the visual look of some things, you know, with the way they present the screen as a computer screen. And whenever I see that, I'm like, okay, I feel like we had an impact. And honestly, like, isn't that cool? Like, you know, we didn't sell the show. We didn't make any money from it. We had a great time doing it. It made an impact, and we were part of the conversation in some form or fashion, which I think is all, you know, on a certain level, is just really satisfying. I would, Jason and I talk all the time about doing something else, doing it again, doing it a different way. And I think we will do that at a certain point when it makes sense.
Yeah, he's another one of those like people that I really admire from a creative perspective. Never met him, but his work is great. Pay attention to what he's doing now on Old Man and 3 as well. You mentioned there, like, you know, that creative inspiration. Where do you find creative inspiration? Because you strike me as like somebody, you know, from knowing you and knowing your work, you do consume a shit ton of media very clearly, and you have to, because it's such a part of your job to be able to commentate on it. But it also makes me feel like you have to find things separate from what you're consuming for research to find inspiration for new things. Is that a fair assumption, that you're having to look outside of like what you're normally consuming to find new ideas?
Sure. I mean, I think I'm always reading. You know, I'm a big fan of history. I'm always reading, you know, scholarly articles. I'm reading books. I'm reading whatever. All of which is to say, I'm kind of like always, I guess, researching. Now, it's good and bad in the sense that hopefully it does give some texture to the work I'm doing. Even, you know, if I'm working in the comic book space, talking about comic book movies, hopefully I'm able to bring some kind of like different discursive conversational perspectives. At the same time, like the downside. What's the downside of that? I always feel like I'm working. I even when I'm like watching Vanderpump Rules, I'm like, oh, that was, you know, it's hard to turn off like research brain sometimes, which is, you know, not to, you know, make this a therapy session, but it's, you know, is a thing that I think about, like, how do I stop feeling like now I am working? Because the flip side of that is sometimes I'm like, I'll be legitimately working, and I'll be like, oh, I'm not being productive right now, but I'm working. Well, hold on, I'm working on something. I'm actually working. Yeah, but like your mind is thinking about this, and you're thinking about researching this, and you're working on this. And so it's good and bad.
Yeah, it's the there's a part of you that lives on that's like watch everything like Inside Baseball. Everything becomes like an analytical watch or an analytical read, and I think it's something that creators struggle with in particular, because you start nitpicking, and it's hard to just like enjoy things from an enjoyment perspective. Especially as somebody in your position that has like such a wide array of topics across, you know, sports and also comic book and nerd culture and everything else. It's like, what don't those topics touch in 2023, right? Like there's everything true. Has some connection to some of them in some little capacity. But we are going to take some audience questions here momentarily. Here is this is the first question. This is from Jan Nil at Jason. Assuming it comes out this year, do you have hope that Microsoft will strike gold with the Fallout show the way that Sony has with TLOU and Nintendo will with the Mario Bros movie? I think jury's still out on the Mario Brothers movie. Yeah. It looks exciting, but like, will it narratively live up to the hype? I think you were talking sort of, you know, a little bit about the production of Fallout. Do you think the question though is like, do you have hope that they'll actually make it work?
Yeah, I mean, I know of I think the people who are behind it really know how to make television. So that gives me hope. And I think that it's an incredible IP. It's one of my favorite video games of all time, favorite video game spaces of all time. I am playing Fallout 4 now again for the umpteenth time on my Steam Deck, and I have a lot of hope for it. It's such a fully realized and weird world. I think part of my question is like, what's the tone of it going to be? Because there's definitely, I mean, if you play the game, there's definitely a lot of funny there. It's also a super dark story.
Yep.
I'm really excited about it. Really, really excited about it. Will we see the sole survivor building settlements? Will we see him or her, installing a water filtration system at Hangman's Alley? I don't know, but I'm eager to see how it comes out, and I can't wait for all the Easter eggs and all the different things. And I just hope we meet Nick Valentine. I hope we meet Nick Valentine in season 1 of that show.
I think for me, I'm excited to see how they integrate factions and how many of them they bring into like a first season as well, because that was of both of the major Bethesda RPG IPs, like both Elder Scrolls and Fallout. What I love most about them is the faction decision trees. More broadly, I've got very fond memories of across both of those series of like, how do I choose, like what, and the playthrough. So I'm really excited to kind of see how they integrate that, because I think you're right. I guess my worry would be they have so much IP to play with. How do they choose what they're playing with? Basically, it's a big old sandbox.
It's gonna be a lot of editing. Will we get to kill Preston Garvey finally and just shut him up in television form? TBD, remains to be seen.
This is from James Durs, which is, which video game show / movie would you like to see Quentin Tarantino direct?
I mean, I'd like to see him. I think the answer is I'd like to see him direct the one that he's interested in directing. He's a person that's got a lot of, huge opinions about movies and things that he's interested in. He does strike me as somebody who, think about the Fantastic Four references in Reservoir Dogs, right? Like it feels like if you gave him the right comic book property, he'd do it. I don't know, but like, let me just cheat and say like Max Payne.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that's not a bad one. Interesting. I think he's such a director that's like hard to place, because his interests are also so broad, right?
Yeah.
Like you look at his films, it's not like he's not a one-hit wonder, and he's not like a one genre defined kind of person. I think that's when I read when I was like thinking of the question, I was just like, oh god, like what do you put him against, right? Like, because he's really hard to nail down. So.
I guess not to there's so much zombie content, but like Left 4 Dead 1 and 2, the characters, the co-op, the kind of like comedy, gore, violence that is also like was also shocking. I think that's another one that Quentin Tarantino could have fun with in a kind of very pulpy way.
Another one for me. What is your most excited sort of comic book IP on the slate? If you had to look at like all the Marvel shows, what's going on at DC right now, which we didn't even touch on, and
oh gosh,
like what
I guess
are you most excited about?
Just because it's next, Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, because it feels like this is going to be the real launch for everything that happens in the phases that follow, with the proper introduction of Kang the Conqueror as the kind of Thanos level big bad for all the movies that happen afterwards. The way that character in the comics intersects with Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four, with Doctor Doom, with various other people, makes the possibility that we could have some, Fantastic Four intros or at least Easter eggs, feel really present and possible. And I think that's the one, just, in part because it's next, that I'm really looking forward to. And Secret Wars, because, on our show, XR Vision, Rosie and I have been so taken with the with just trying to figure out like who is a Skrull. For those who don't know, Skrulls are the
Secret Scroll Watch.
yes, Secret Skrull Watch. Skrulls are the alien race that can shapeshift and look like any other kind of alien, and humans in particular. They're kind of built to worm their way into into behind the scenes and kind of do espionage on an intergalactic scale. And so the question of who right now in the Marvel universe is actually a Skrull in disguise is a rich and fun one.
I think I'm just excited to hear people stop like getting their hopes up with the most recent phase of the MCU too, because like like it's if you compare it to phase 1, it's much different, right? It's like, yeah, it's the most content ever produced in any one Marvel phase, because now we have television shows, right? 8 parts, 1 hour long each. Like the hours rack up, but at the same time, it's like it was all meant to be exposition for this, like, build other way they're building up. And you're right, Ant-Man is the way to start putting it to actual sort of bigger storyline narrative. Actually, question on that: do you think the Kang the Conqueror we're meeting in Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania is that going to be the one that is the ultimate Kang, or is he one of the many others?
No, I think there are going to be many others, but I think that he is probably the Kang that is going to be the big bad. He's been trapped in the quantum realm for an unknown amount of time, and he needs Scott Lang's help to get out. That's my guess on what the basic story is.
I hope so. Seeing the trailers, I hope he kicks Ant-Man's ass, to be honest.
It's going to be hard it's honestly hard for me to understand like how Ant-Man can even go toe to toe with him, but that's fine. We'll see.
Well, yeah, but I'm also like, I'm hoping this isn't like, oh, we killed one Kang and now there's like, it's Hydra. There's a billion fucking other Kangs out there, right? Like, it's like, no, make this one the one, make him like have some real stakes like Thanos did, kill off some people, make him, extremely fearsome, and then, like, open him up, right? Basically, like make him wreak havoc on the rest of the.
Yeah, certainly if he is the Kang, which I think that's a pretty good guess. Then he is the Kang that killed all the other Kangs, or is at least in the process of killing all the other Kangs. By kill a great Kang trick, which always works, is some Kang will call a meeting or organize a congress of the Kangs and be like, hey, let's get together and let's talk about how we can divide up the multiverse. But really, like, they're getting everybody together so they can kill all the other Kangs. And it works every time, folks.
Yes. I'm very excited in a couple of weeks when the movie's out. So question from our producer Prem, who is he's recovering from some travel, so he wants me to ask for him. What are your thoughts on Netflix's Resident Evil? And did you make it through the entire train wreck of a weird show?
I didn't. I think I was excited for it, but I think both the movies and the Netflix version are a good example of, hey, all this lore doesn't need to be here. We don't need to make it as weird as the video game. The video game is weird for a specific reason. And it won't translate if you try to do it. It's just too much to keep track of. And I think it's a good example of why you don't make an adaptation. You don't always like hew for fidelity to the original story when you're adapting something. You're going to have to change some things to make it work for the different medium. And I felt like they didn't change it enough.
Yeah, I have a soft spot for some of the Resident Evil movies.
Sure.
From the like early 2000s. They're like, we were talking about Doom being a guilty pleasure earlier. There's some of those that I'm just like, yeah, but you're right. Like, they're just like too deep. The best movies should be the best movies should be, and in video game adaptation should be where, like, exactly what you were saying earlier, the main plot line should be able to be explained very quickly. You should be able to get through the main plot very quickly. Now, obviously, you want to expand around that and like any side plots, etc. Like, enrich the universe here, but like, if you need to have a scene where it's like, okay,
somebody's going to sit down and they're going to open a big book that they found somewhere in the heart of some ancient fortress, and then they're going to read 8 minutes of flashback it's too much, folks. Like, let's streamline this.
Yeah, 100%. No, and that's actually the last you talk about flashback overdone in entertainment. Very well done in The Last of Us. In that first episode at the end, it's I was like, yes, good flashback. I'm happy about this use of it. We'll end on this though. This is also another audience question from Loves Wars, which is, what is your favorite Taika Waititi TV show or movie, and are you okay with the possibility of him doing a live action version of Akira?
I am okay with it. It would probably be Thor Ragnarok, because from the opening scenes of that movie, I was like knocked out at how different and unexpected and funny and creative it was. It really like effectively harnessed Chris Hemsworth just kind of like natural comedic ability, such a winning guy. And I think I love Thor 1. I think Thor Dark World is not necessarily a great movie, but it's an important one, and it's also one that I really like because I'm a stupid simp for this stuff. But he was so dour and Shakespearean in those first two, and kind of unleashing that comedy side of him was really cool. And I just think Taika is like just one of the most creative people working today.
Yeah, I have to give the question was not for me, but I have to give some love to Jojo Rabbit as well. It's it's making such a caricature of such a horrific figure in history and Adolf Hitler, and doing it in a way that like you don't feel horror when you watch the show or watch the movie. It like actually well delivery. So thanks for watching Visionaries on YouTube. For more content, please subscribe to the Overcome channel.